Former Beatle John Lennon is dead. Lennon died in a hospital shortly after being shot outside his New York apartment tonight.
Hello and welcome to episode 3, part 2 of Between the Facts, where we look at John Lennon's life, death and the conspiracies that continue to surround that. We looked in the last episode at John's early years, through his primary school, his high school, the Quarrymen meeting McCartney, his rise to megastardom. We heard from David, who talked about the links between Liverpool and New York around the love of skiffle music, all of these things that made Lennon appreciate music and grow with his partnership with McCartney and later on with the Beatles. And Dan spoke to us about how beautifully constructed some of those songs were. I think it's very difficult to deny that Lennon, then Lennon and McCartney, and then Lennon again was some of the greatest songs ever written. The writing style was beautiful. It was poetic. It was evocative of so many emotions and thoughts, and still is. People still link to those songs. And every year we still have Lennon's hits coming out, and that keeps him present. Now, unfortunately, we all know that Lennon was killed on the 8th of December 1980 outside the Dakota building. He died way too young with so much more to give to his family, his friends, his art, his fans. And now, unfortunately, it's time to look at the man behind the murder of Lennon. That's Mark David Chapman. Before we go into the podcast, I'd just like to say that we're very, very proud that we've become affiliated with the You Run Podcast Network now, covering all kinds of entertainment, movie reviews, horror, true crime, etc. You can go over to yourunpodcast.com, have a look at all the shows that make up the network, try them out, follow, they're all on Instagram, the usual social medias. Give them a follow. We like to call it the home of entertainment, and we hope you agree. Let's talk about who Mark David Chapman was before we move into the conspiracy. So he was born on 10th of May 1955. He lived in a small town in Decatur. I'm going to pronounce that incorrectly, in Georgia, so apologies to any Georgians out there listening. It's funny, you look at his upbringing and it seems fairly normal. It's difficult to really say, what causes somebody to turn, to change. But, his dad was a staff sergeant in the US Air Force. His mum was a nurse. He had a younger sister. Yeah, he'd made comments later on in life that he was very, very afraid of his dad because, he claimed that his dad would be physically abusive towards his mother and that he would escape. He would fantasize about having, godlike power over little people in the walls of his bedroom. But to me, that feels like a normal child's fantasy. I don't think it necessarily indicates, a predilection to becoming a murderer or having mental health issues as you're older. So when he was 14, it was noted at Columbia High School that he'd started to skip classes, using drugs, becoming more of a handful, more of a problem child. Even at one point where he ran away from home to live on the streets of Miami for 2 weeks, and I bet that was an experience. Yeah. So in 1971, he became a born-again Presbyterian. I don't think that would have any impact on who he became. But he was popular at that time. He would support he'd become a counsellor at summer camps for the YMCA, and he would have, he would go down as being known as an outstanding worker. He was promoted to assistant director after winning the outstanding counsellor. So at that point in his life, he seemed to be a fairly, inverted commas, normal child. I think this is where, if we look at information from other murder cases and other people that fit within the jacket of the lone gunman. We see this book title appear, and it's The Catcher in the Rye, and it was after that Chapman was introduced to this book that you started to see significant changes in his personality, although not completely. So, you know, he even admitted that he saw himself as the main character, Holden Caulfield, and that it was up to him to live in that way. But even at that point, when he's starting to build that alternative reality for himself, he's still working hard to support other people. So, you know, he worked at World Vision, helping Vietnamese refugees in a resettlement camp. You know, high praise from his co-workers and his coordinators at that time, to the point where he even met US President Gerald Ford at the time. You know, so you've got this, you know, you've got this young man who is trying to grow up, but then starting to maybe fray at the edges, some drug use. He was starting to have mental health issues around guilt, around affairs he was having with other counsellors. In 1977, Chapman relocated to Hawaii, which culminated in him trying to kill himself. He got into his car, put a pipe to the exhaust, turned the engine on, and that was it. Fortunately for him, the hose melted. That culminated in being sectioned into a local hospital, psychiatric ward. And then after his release, he started work as a maintenance worker. I think the thing we see there is we see this unraveling of him. We see this fairly normal childhood moving on, being a good conscientious worker, but then after the introduction of The Catcher in the Rye? Who knows? He starts to unravel. He then went on a 6-week trip around the world. He using his YMCA connections, he went to Tokyo, Hong Kong, Bangkok, Geneva, London, Dublin, and ended up in a brief visit to Atlanta. This culminated in a meeting and later marrying a Japanese-American woman called Gloria Abe. Chapman spent 2 periods of employment at the Castle Memorial Hospital, where he'd been an inpatient in the psychiatric ward. But both of those stints failed, and he ended up working as a night security guard. And that's where his drinking started. He became a very, very heavy drinker. And it's at this point that people recognise that his psychological state had worsened. It was noted, or it reported, that he had started to build within his mind a series of obsessions, particular pieces of art. But The Catcher in the Rye, the music of John Lennon. And in 1980, the September of, he wrote a letter to a friend, Linda Irish, in which he stated, "I'm going nuts." And he signed the letter, The Catcher in the Rye. Up until the time he killed Lennon, he'd had no criminal convictions and was therefore unknown to the police. So what do we know about why Chapman killed Lennon? You know, he was a self-confessed fan of the Beatles, you know, long time fan of the Beatles, but during his confessions he would say that he'd been planning the murder for 3 months. It's strange, you know, that he says again that it was Lennon's religious conversion, and his comment that the Beatles were more famous than Jesus, which turned him against Lennon. I think, you know, Chapman could well have done with a sense of humour at that point. I think the comment that Lennon made was a humorous comment and not meant in any way to be offensive or indicative. According to Chapman's wife, he was also influenced quite heavily by a book called John Lennon One Day at a Time, which was written by Anthony Fawcett. This book went on to talk about Lennon's lavish lifestyle in New York. He would often go around, and rant at his wife, saying that he was angry at Lennon, who would preach about love and peace, but have millions and millions of dollars to spend on his home, his house, all the things he wanted. There's a book called Let Me Take You Down, Inside the Mind of Mark David Chapman, the man who killed John Lennon, written by a gentleman called Jack Jones, in which Chapman says, I would listen to his music and I would get angry at him for saying in the song that he didn't believe in God, that he just believed in him and Yoko, that he didn't believe in the Beatles. This was another thing that angered me, even though this record had been done for at least 10 years previously. I just wanted to scream out loud, who does he think he is, saying these things about God and heaven and the Beatles, saying that he doesn't believe in Jesus and things like that. At that point, my mind was going through a total blackness of anger, of rage, so I brought the Lennon book home into this, The Catcher in the Rye milieu, where my mindset is Holden Caulfield and anti-phoniness. It's very, very plain to see at that point that Chapman had lost all contact with reality, that he had become so fixated with Lennon that the destruction of John Lennon would be his catharsis. Totally unreasonable. So we then go through a little bit of time where he's in Atlanta, he's moving around a little bit, and then he comes to New York on December the 6th, 1980, with the intention of jumping from the Statue of Liberty. This he didn't do. Continuing his tour of New York, his mission as he saw it, on December the 7th, he actually accosted singer James Taylor at the 72nd subway station, and James Taylor's spoken about this. He said, from an interview, the guy had sort of pinned me to the wall and was glistening with maniacal sweat and talking some freak speak about what he was going to do and his stuff with how John was interested and how he was going to get in touch with John Lennon. That same day, 7th of December, he offered cocaine to a taxi driver. The same night, Chapman and his wife talked on the phone about getting help with his problems by first working on his relationship with God. So you can see time and time again, he's slipping away. On the day of the 8th, Chapman left his room at the Sheraton Hotel. He took his copy of Catcher in the Rye, in which he had written his statement, and signed it Holden Caulfield. He spent most of the day at the entrance to the Dakota building where John Lennon lived, talking to fans and the doorman. Thankfully, Lennon was able to leave the Dakota building at that point to pre-arranged interviews and photo shoots. Chapman was not impressed that he'd missed him. Around 5 p.m, Lennon and Ono left the Dakota building to go to a recording session. They walked towards their limousine and Chapman stepped out with a copy of the Double Fantasy album. Lennon duly signed it, and this is captured by photographer Paul Goresh. Around 10:50, Lennon and Ono returned to the Dakota building. They got out of a limousine and walked towards the arched entrance of the building. Chapman stepped out on the street behind them and fired 5 shots from his .38 Special, 4 of which hit Lennon. Chapman remained at the scene following the shooting and appeared to be reading his copy of The Catcher in the Rye as the police arrived. Lennon was taken to hospital where he subsequently died. Chapman remained calm, didn't speak, didn't say anything. In subsequent interviews, the police officers have stated that Chapman actually told them, "I'm sure the big part of me is Holden Caulfield, who is the main person in the book. The small part of me must be the devil." And that was it. Chapman had killed Lennon, had taken that person, that art, that music, that father, son, friend, poet, musician from this world. Chapman would never stand trial for what he did. Initially pleading innocent, his lawyer seeking on the grounds of mental incapacity. It was only when we got round to June of 81 that Chapman changed his mind. He pled guilty, said that God had told him to plead guilty, and the judge then passed on the sentence of 25 years to life. Mark David Chapman has been through the parole process many, many times since then, and has been denied. In fact, he has had 14 parole hearings, each one denied. Paranormal Misfits. Besties Nino Daniel and Chrissy D with their podcast looking at the paranormal, mysteries and unravelling mind-boggling conspiracies. Available on all platforms, YouTube, and part of the YouRun podcast network. So now let's look at some of the conspiracy surrounding Lennon's death. It really doesn't take a lot of Googling or looking on YouTube to find videos and articles about why it couldn't have been Mark David Chapman, or why he didn't act alone, or why it was aliens. There's lots and lots out there. Looking on YouTube, you'll find a video by an ex-TV producer called David Whelan, who claims that there were 8 bullet holes or damage caused by 8 bullets at the scene, and therefore, as Chapman only had a .38 revolver and we know only 5 shots were fired, then how could there be 8 wounds or 8 damages? So this is really quite easy to disprove. If we look at photographic evidence at the Dakota building, what Whelan is doing is Whelan is counting the 4 rounds that hit Lennon and the 1 round that didn't. Okay, so 4 plus 5. That's what logic and that's what fact states. What he's also then doing, though, is counting that 3 of those shots went through Lennon's body and damaged windows and doors of the Dakota. So he's claiming there's 8 shots. Well, there's not. There's 5, 3 of which passed through Lennon's body. I think we can quite safely say that is not correct. Whelan then goes on to claim that if the shots didn't come from Chapman firing 8, that there was somebody inside the Dakota building firing 3 out. Again, this is quite easily disproved by the actual physical evidence of the entrance and exit wounds. Claims that Chapman could not have made the shots due to the grouping. Well, I'm English. He may know a little bit more about guns and shooting because he's American, but the distance wasn't great and the recoil of the gun wouldn't have been phenomenal. So I would disclaim that one as well. One of the ones which is much more interesting and links through to the JFK assassination, the Sharon Tate murders, Roman Polanski, Charles Manson, and this and others is MK Ultra. And MK Ultra was a mind control experiment that the CIA started in the 1950s, which was using hallucinogens like LSD, for example, to actually take control of somebody to commit an act without them realizing they were doing it. It's a very famous film with Frank Sinatra, remade with Denzel Washington, called The Manchurian Candidate. And there is some speculation that Mark David Chapman was a Manchurian candidate. There is absolutely nothing anywhere to substantiate this. Absolutely nothing. I think it's always the conspiracy's stablemate where they go, it was the CIA, it was the FBI, it was a government agency, it was outside forces. I think the most simple explanation and the most logical explanation for Lennon's death was that Mark David Chapman did it, that he did it of his own free will, following his own obsession. We go from conspiracies that somewhat root themselves in reality, MK Ultra actually happened, to conspiracies which should dumbfound you with how bizarre they are. And I think this is, having looked at cases for this podcast and having an interest in this kind of thing, this is one of the most bizarre ones. And this conspiracy is that Stephen King, the author, horror writer, killed John Lennon. And when I read it at first, I thought, this is just so silly. I'll read it and give myself a bit of a giggle. It's well known that the FBI had files on Lennon because they were afraid of his influence, his what they believed were communist tendencies, and that would, this is only 25 years after McCarthyism, that would have an effect on his fans, on the youth of America, and could start a rampant retooling of America away from capitalism. So we know those files exist, and we know that up until the mid-70s, Lennon was being heavily monitored by them as well. So we do know that's a fact. But this conspiracy that Stephen King shot Lennon at the request of Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. It's an author called Stephen Lightfoot who brought that accusation to bear, or the allegation. Lightfoot actually went so far as to drive around New York in a car with billboards on it stating that Stephen King had done this. He had leaflets printed up, pamphlets which he would distribute to people saying Stephen King killed John Lennon. I don't know how you could even take that seriously personally. It does have a bit of a funny twist though, this conspiracy theory, where Stephen King actually wrote to Lightfoot to say, can you stop this now? It's been going on for years and it's disrespectful to Lennon and it's not doing me any good. Lightfoot responded by saying that somebody who claimed to have killed John Lennon wrote to him many, many years earlier, and that the handwriting matched Stephen King's handwriting. So Stephen King was damned whether he did or whether he didn't. But the idea of a successful author becoming a government hitman is just, it's more far-fetched than one of King's stories. One of the main witnesses to the murder of Lennon, somebody that went to his aid after he'd been shot, was the doorman, Jose Perdomo. There's a book, or a documentary rather, called The Day John Lennon Died, and that suggested that the doorman was a Cuban exile with links to the CIA. It's just amazing that people reach for these things instead of accepting fact and death. The conspiracy theories have been documented in many books and many films. There's a 1990 book called Who Killed John Lennon by a barrister and journalist called Fenton Bresler. This is where he talks about the MK Ultra, the Manchurian Candidate theory. There's a playwright from Liverpool called Ian Carroll who had a stage drama called One Bad Thing, and that again talks about, did a rogue wing of the CIA manipulate Chapman to get Lennon off the scene, so to speak. If you're ever lucky enough to visit New York, if you're a Lennon fan, you'll want to take yourself to the Dakota Building. But take a few moments just to turn around, back to the building, look straight across the avenue, and you'll see Central Park. After a few moments of crossing that road, over the wall, down the short path, you'll find Strawberry Fields. Strawberry Fields is an area of the park which New York City designated to Lennon in 1985. It's a place where Beatles fans and Lennon fans alike congregate to try and walk in his steps, try and reconnect with his essence, to be near his spirit. It's rumoured that part of the park, with it being so close to the Dakota building, it was Lennon's favourite walk with his son. It's not necessarily a quiet place because there are always people playing Beatles songs, Lennon songs on guitars, on Bluetooth speakers, but it is definitely one of the main meeting places in New York, and well worth a visit if you're there. So here we are at the end of episode 3. John Lennon, we've talked about his life in Liverpool, we've talked about his music, his friendships, we've talked about his killer, we've talked about the conspiracies. If you are a Lennon fan, he'll never leave you. Death doesn't take away his music, his art. If you're not a Lennon fan, you're not going to get it. I spent many years not being a Beatles fan until one day I woke up and went, that's it. So yeah, join us soon for episode 4. Thank you very, very much for listening. We do appreciate your time. Thank you.